Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the side event of UNGASS, Gender Equality and Anti-Corruption. Two themes, one goal. It is an issue of utmost importance, as we saw in the extended discussions we had on the respective text in the political declaration. Before we start, I would like to give you some technical advice. Please mute your micros. You can use the chat all the time and be aware that this event is recorded. So if you don't like it, you just can go out and see it later on the internet. Welcome to the participants of the panel. I would like to welcome Karin Jämtin. She is the former Minister of Development of Sweden and the actual Director General of Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. Also, very welcome to Jennifer Savary Bradford, the crime prevention specialist at UNODC. And last but not least, very welcome Dr. Mary Kimari, Director at the Office of the Ombudsman in Kenya. To present myself, my name is Daniel Kemken. I'm a former head of section in the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. Before we start the panel discussion, let us listen to the video message, the welcome speech of the Parliamentary State Secretary of our Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, Dr. Maria Flaxbart.
Excellencies, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our side event today on the topic Gender Equality and Anti-Corruption, two themes, one goal. Gender and corruption are tied to one another in complex ways. The recent report on this topic from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, shows that women are no less susceptible to corruption than men. However, improving gender equality helps stop corruption. Because corruption is based on patronage and clientelism, which are strongly characterized by domination through the use of power. Women are often excluded from these power networks, whether because of social norms or because of their often precarious living situations, or for both reasons. At the same time, women are particularly at risk of suffering from the impacts of corruption. They are frequently employed in the informal sector, have less access to education and information, and make more use of certain services, for example, health services. As a result, they are particularly at risk of coming into contact with corrupt people in positions of power who try to deny them their rights. Furthermore, girls and women are vulnerable to a particularly deceptive form of corruption, namely sextortion. This means that they are faced demands for sexual favors in return for being given access to resources or services. All these goes to show that if anti-corruption measures are to be effective, then the gender dimensions of corruption also need to be taken into account. Incidentally, besides girls and women, there are also other socially disadvantaged groups, for example, people with disabilities or ethnic or sexual minorities, who are affected by the interaction between corruption and discrimination. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has made the situation even worse. Because the pandemic has created ideal conditions for exploitation and corruption, rising poverty and precarious working conditions combined with competition for scarce resources and urgently needed services. Let me give you an example from the health sector. Corruption in this sector in connection with the procurement of medicinal personal protective equipment, PPE, during the pandemic has meant a higher risk of infection for medical personnel, 70% of whom are women. But there is also hope, because the pandemic has created global political momentum of rebuilding better after the crisis under the motto Recover Forward. The idea is that we can use the recovery as an opportunity to break up harmful structures and practices. This includes taking steps to ensure that women and other groups who have been marginalized in the past are equally included in political decision-making. Only then will they be able to become agents of change. Only then will we be able to rise the full potential of our societies to make the best possible use of resources and make fair and sustainable development in the spirit of the 2030 Agenda possible. Let us redouble our efforts in the fight against discrimination and corruption. The UNODC report, "The Time is Now," is a good foundation for doing that, because we need more awareness and more evidence for the various impacts of corruption on gender equality and vice versa. That is why we value the intensive efforts made in the negotiations by the national delegations to introduce a language of gender and equality into a political declaration issued by UNGASS. What is more, the linkages between gender and corruption also need to flow into the Conference of the States Parties, into the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, so that the principles of leave no one behind also becomes firmly established here too. I thank our partners from Sweden and UNODC, the co-organizers of today's event, and I hope that our exchange will bring us closer to our shared goal, a world that is free of corruption and discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will remember one main message: a more inclusive society is a less corrupt society. As our event is co-organized between Sweden and Germany, it's now an honor for me to invite Karin Jemtin, the director of CEDA, with your welcome words, with your messages for the beginning of the event, please.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, to take part in this side event. To start off with, I would like to state a big thank you to UNODC and the Conference of the States Parties for organizing a special session on corruption. And I would also like to start with a thank you to my German colleagues for being the main organizers of this important side event on gender equality and anti-corruption. Corruption is one of the biggest obstacles to poverty reduction and sustainable development, putting the achievement of the whole 2030 agenda at risk. That's why Sweden includes anti-corruption as an explicit goal in many of the new bilateral, regional, and global thematic strategies. The strategies guides CEDA's work in our development cooperation. This, including a specific goal on corruption, has raised the level of ambition in our fight against corruption. Corruption and gender inequality are in many ways closely connected. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by corruption in sectors such as health, education, and elsewhere, but also disproportionately affected in fragile contexts. Given the unequal gender relations, women are more exposed to corruption and also more exposed to the consequences of corruption. When poor women cannot pay corrupt officials or persons holding positions of power, they risk being exposed to sextortion. This is, as was mentioned before by this previous speaker, the abuse of power and position in exchange for sexual favors. Sextortion affects women at far higher rates than men. There are mutual and damaging relationships. Gender inequality breeds corruption and vice versa. Corruption tends to exacerbate gender inequalities. But we have also learned that anti-corruption and gender equality efforts tend to be mutually reinforcing. Synergies between the two thematic areas can strengthen results achievement both in terms of improved gender equality as well as reduced corruption. And I would like to underline how happy I am that UNODC has produced a report, The Time Is Now. I'm looking forward to hearing more on it. It's a very useful basis for analysis and action. The commitment to gender equality and the empowerment of women that we make in the political declaration here at UNGASS is an important step in addressing the gender differentiated impact of corruption. Applying a gender perspective is necessary if we are to find effective strategies to combat corruption and achieve sustainable development. I'm looking forward to today's event, and I'm hoping that today's event will be a useful and productive exchange on concrete approaches and on concrete tools that can be applied by member states to advance the anti-corruption and gender equality agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin. Clear messages, and you also already mentioned the report, The Time Is Now. Mrs. Jennifer Savary Bradford. Jennifer, you are one of the coordinators of this valuable report. Would you be so kind to highlight the main findings of this report to us?
Thank you, Mr. Kempken, and obviously thank you also to Director General Jämtin for participating, and thank you for organizing this side event and for inviting UNODC to present some of the main findings of The Time Is Now, addressing the gender dimensions of corruption. So as you may or may not know, this is actually UNODC's first foray into this multi-layered and complex subject, which affects every country and every society differently. And in fact, what you will see inside the publication that sometimes even within one country, there are different dimensions that impact women and men differently. In complementing Dr. Flaxbart's intervention, I do want to point out this publication doesn't point to either men or women as being more or less corrupt or even corruptible. The Time Is Now, however, does highlight how men more frequently have access to decision-making and other positions of power, where acts of corruption more frequently occur in the form of abuse of power. Gender inequality in power structures is a well-documented phenomenon and subject. But you can also look at the scenario in a different way. It portrays the opposite of diversity. A predominantly single-sex group that caters to its own members and their successes, mostly at the cost of excluding others. Now, depending on how deep-seated the group's societal norms are, by not being represented in the group, women will not only end up being left outside, but also being actively excluded. Now, there are several examples in The Time Is Now that highlight how a more diverse and inclusive work environment is a less corrupt one, And this is true both in the private as well as in the public sector. This is also the reason why we point to the anti-corruption policies and gender equality policies as being mutually reinforcing. Looking at it in an even wider context, diversity in decision-making processes such as public budgeting can have a significant impact on how public funds are spent and who will benefit from that decision. A diverse group will have a more inclusive approach than one where only one sex is represented, which in the end results in a more inclusive society. Therefore, gender and diversity are agents for change in the fight against corruption. To conclude, while the publication showcases a wide range of current thinking around the gender dimensions of corruption, it is primarily a qualitative report. It looks at the context in which these gendered forms of corruption appear and how different groups are impacted, and also highlights good practices from around the world of how to address them. But the time now also points out that there is a lack of quantitative research. So the data around this intersectional subject is still rare. And in fact, we need both types of data, quantitative and qualitative, numbers and context, to paint a fuller picture and provide the evidence base that we need to make and implement policies to fight corruption. I shall end my intervention here by quoting Sylvie Dury, who is the director of the Swiss Federal Office for Gender Equality. Those who are invisible in data are also invisible in policies. We need more data. So I'm standing by to answer any questions, and I thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think the interlinkage, the relationship, the strong relationship between gender and anti-corruption is evident. But what does that mean in practical terms? What does it mean in real life? I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Mary Kimari from the Kenyan Office of the Ombudsman. You are working on the front, so to say. Can you present us some good practices in your work?
Thank you very much. I seem to be having gaps, but I'm assuming it's me making the presentation. One thing that I've realized, all of us seem to appreciate that corruption ideally is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. That is something that we seem to have in common understanding. And it endangers the democracy, the equality, the rule of law, ethical values, and also justice. In Kenya, the Commission of Administrative Justice squarely then falls on that aspect whereby corruption endangers justice, and we're supposed to be the ones that protect or ensure that we support administrative justice in the country. We find the aspects of corruption that undermine the quality and the quantity of public services, which reduces resources available, ultimately exacerbating social and gender disparity, throwing us now at the deep end to try and come up with solutions to try and ensure that we create a balance, or we try to mitigate, as we're still attempting to eradicate corruption and gender inequality. This is a very interesting topic when you look at it from that perspective, where we're talking about the gender balance and also anti-corruption. Some of the things that we've done, the practical aspects that have come out, is one, based on our mandate. Our mandate is twofold, where we have one aspect of ensuring that we mitigate or we do away with maladministration in the country, to ensure that every citizen enjoys public services. So if you infringe on that specific right, perhaps due to abuse of office, which in itself is corruption, then we pick it up and try to ensure that we remedy that scenario by giving out either reports, recommendations, determinations, that are supposed to be implemented to ensure that we create an equilibrium. So the first one is on the aspects of complaint mechanism, and the second one is the access to information. On access to information, some of the practical approaches that we've picked out is one, we appreciate that we must strengthen the education, our education system on both gender and corruption. This is by partnering with the various tertiary institutions, that's our universities, and the colleges, to ensure that the curriculum entrenches this aspect of gender balance and corruption. We also bring about all the MDAs, these are the government institutions, and encourage the application of participatory and gender responsive budgeting, which then boils down to the decision making, hence pushing all the MDAs to realign their recruitment policies in such a way that they mainstream the gender balance within the institutions. On the aspect of complaints mechanism, we undertake capacity building of the MDAs so that we may increase the capacity of the service providers in creating a gender responsive or a gender sensitive reporting mechanism. This is an approach that we've picked out as a commission. Not only do we have our own gender responsive complaints mechanism, but we try now to push it out. We try to spread it out to the various others MDAs with the realization that as a commission, we cannot or would not have the capacity to change the country within the shortest time possible on aspects of gender balance and corruption. So we need to hold hands here with the various other MDAs, and the only way that we can do that is by capacity building in those other institutions so that they help us then to spread out the gospel on gender balance and anti-corruption. This is with the realization that in fact, the perception that the female gender is less corrupt is simply a perception. But the evidence that we have at hand is ideally, depending on the factors, either gender shall be deemed to be corrupt at almost similar percentages, depending on what form of corruption that we are discussing. We also cultivate a lot of a partnership by forging alliances with various groups, notably partnering to offer technical support to the women support groups and also the persons living with disability forums. As we come up with the various complaints, gender sensitive complaints mechanism, we recognize the aspect of the whistleblower and the witness protection system, which necessitates policies in these areas to be formulated so that it may guide an effective complaints mechanism system, which will help us to combat corruption, taking care of the different genders that are able to make the complaints. We note that in Kenya, the number of complaints that are made by women are far less than those that are made by men. And this we appreciate is due to lack of information. Lack of information means that the gender is not properly empowered to make decisions. And hence our quest to lay out the framework on access to information all over the country, which in fact, come Friday, this Friday, we are launching a public participation on the access to information regulations, which is supposed to jumpstart the Access to Information Act. So we know that despite evidence of the correlation between corruption and the gender inequality, most policies have failed to emphasize and address this linkage between gender balance and anti-corruption, And hence our dissemination of information has acquired a gender perspective, which is imperative in order for us to battle corruption. And we're trying to entrench strategies into policy making or the policy formulation within the MDAs that have a differentiated analysis of the impact of corruption on both men and women. We also encourage anti-corruption policies to take into account a gendered perspective, a rights-based approach, and also to examine the power relations between men and our women on the backdrop of our culture as Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary Kimari. Access to information, gender-sensitive reporting, and of course, gender-responsive budgeting. These are the keywords of the many good things you are doing. I think we are ready now for the actual panel. Let us start with the Agenda 2030, the fundamental law of sustainable development, or the Bible of sustainable development. Gender equality and anti-corruption are very important elements of it. Gender equality has its own SDG, SDG 5. Anti-corruption is part of access to justice, SDG 16, or as Mrs. Karen Jemtin said, corruption is an obstacle for the whole agenda. So both topics we are discussing today are transversal. And therefore, my question is, what are the holistic steps we can do or we have to take? I would like to start with Karin, and maybe Jennifer and Mary can add some observations from their point of view. Please, Karin.
Holistic steps. I don't think, it's a bad way of starting maybe, but I don't think that we would need more frameworks or more papers to be adopted. Language should always be added into political statements like this one at the UNGASS, but otherwise there's no need for an overarching framework. As you pointed out, David, Daniel, there are Goal 5 on gender and Goal 16 on institution building or setups around that, where both of these topics are found in the Agenda 2030. We also have language around the topic of corruption in different other areas, in different other sections, and we have language on gender, for example, from the IACC from 2018, that points out the linkages. So an holistic approach would be for all of us to remind everyone that there is a clear link in small or big interventions when talking to leaders in our own countries or partner countries, but also when talking to representatives of different bodies that we work with. So there are many interventions that could be done. But I would like to just say one final word, and that is, when it comes to gender and when it comes to corruption, they have one thing in common, and they are both issues that touches power relations. And that is extremely important to recognize when finding ways to work with anti-corruption and to strengthen the possibility of women or the gender perspective in the anti-corruption work. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much. Are there some more observations by Jennifer or by Mary?
Sure. I mean, I think I completely agree with Director General Yamteen. I think it's the transversal element of gender is equal for the transversal element of corruption and the fight against corruption. I think that UNGASS right now, with the political declaration in front of it, a lot of effort went into, in particular, the negotiation surrounding this paragraph in the draft relating to better understanding the interlinkages between gender and corruption. This is a hugely important step forward, and to my knowledge, it's the first time a UN document of this at this level has been adopted. And I do believe that this is going to push forward the idea that we cannot treat these two in isolation. They have to be seen together because, again, it is a question of power and power relations. And going back to my first intervention, if we look at the fact that there is a gender imbalance in the power structures around the world, this is something that we need to take seriously. And again, an inclusive society is a less corrupt society. The time is now, right? That's the title of the publication. And we have this fantastic opportunity now with UNGASS to push this and move it ahead and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mary?
I note from my country, Kenya, in fact, we've tried to ensure that we pass a constitutional amendment bill 2018, just to ensure 2/3 gender equality in parliament. It failed the 4th time. So when I look at it from a holistic perspective, I'm looking at a scenario whereby we do not only rely on the change beginning at this high level, because at times we might wait since 2013. In fact, our constitution was promulgated in 2010, all the way to 2021. We are yet to have that gender mainstream at the high levels of our government. But what it is that we need to be doing is now pick up an approach whereby, as I think Jennifer has brought it out, well, individual MDAs now pick up and come up with policies that understand, that appreciate, that recognize the impact of gender balance and anti-corruption, come up with the policies and start applying. It starts small, but the movement is going to catch up. And within no time, we'll have managed to pick up the momentum as a country, the momentum as a world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think we are excellently coming with your words to the next topic, gender and corruption, the interlinkage, and the question of advantages of diversity. It was already mentioned in this event, and I would like to give the floor again to Jennifer, talking a bit more about practical examples, especially on the aspect of the advantages that diversity in leadership will have.
Thank you. Remember to unmute myself here. I think, if we start looking at this, we need to appreciate one thing. We all exist not in a vacuum. I mean, here we can say we're in a vacuum, we understand what is at stake. In reality, in any public administration, in any society, we are surrounded and we are influenced by societal norms. These will also feed our biases and our stereotypes. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most important aspects to appreciate is that we are all biased. But the question is, are we aware of our biases? And here there are several very good and important examples in the time as now. We can speak, for instance, of the Supreme Court of Mexico that has developed a protocol to address gender bias in its decisions in the judiciary. We can speak about Switzerland that has brought up, for instance, you know, the gender equality requirement in all public procurement. The same in Spain. You know, there are so many important examples out there, and I think the starting point will have to be to realize that there is an issue. Yeah? And I think if we start there, then we level the playing field automatically, somehow. So I don't know if you want me to go even further into this. I don't want to take up too much time. I know we have other very important interventions here, but just to say that I think diversity, we see it in so many circumstances where if you have an imbalance, you will also have decisions that result in, you know, favoring one particular bias, right? This is also valid in the private sector. And there have been studies about this, about how having more women on boards, for instance, means and results in better financial prospects for the company. So I think overall, diversity is a key to unlock so many opportunities, as I said, both in the private and in the public sector. Thank you
very much, Jennifer. I would like to listen much more to you, but they asked me to do the whole event in 50 minutes. We will not do it in 50 minutes, but maybe in 60 we will get it. And therefore, I like to go to the next topic. It's again that it's the topic Dr. Mary has already mentioned, and part of your work, access to information and reporting mechanisms. We learned, most of us already knew, that perception of corruption and also the being affected by corruption is different by the different genders, by men and women. And when we look at vulnerable groups of the population, it's even more complicated. I think in Kenya, the Office of the Ombudsman is doing a great job in it. And therefore, Mary, I would like to ask you to shed a bit more light on the role of the different institutions and agencies, national and international, to work well on that issue. I think you are mute.
Sorry, I'm glad you're able to appreciate the work that the Ombudsman is doing in Kenya currently on the aspect of the perception of corruption and gender balance. However, I do not want to pipe it, noting that we are still constrained. Regardless, that I insist that we must start doing it small, in our own small capacity. At the end of it, we still require our leaders to support us, because we require a lot of financial support, a lot of human support to ensure that we are able to move around the country and uphold this. Now, we have various institutions and agencies that manage corruption and gender balance in our country. However, the most interesting thing is that the agencies or the commissions pick out one area. So like I have EACC, what I would be referring to as the Anti-Corruption Commission, simply deals with matters corruption. And to them, corruption does not have a perspective of gender. It's simply corruption. So whether you're a woman, whether you're a man, you're corrupt, there's no sensitive way, there's no approach to it other than the general approach that has been formulated to deal with corrupt aspects. When we look at the National Gender Commission, that is our NCEC, the one that deals now with gender, again, this specific commission specializes on women. The gender here is women. I would understand where they're coming from, noting that prehistoric, we've had, for the longest time, we've never had a gender balance in the world, and this has also happened in Kenya, really. So they focus greatly on gender. And that's where now we are pushed in as a commission that has a more impartial way of looking at it, not only do we look at corruption as corruption, but we look at corruption and the various dimensions or perspective of corruption, and hence embracing the aspect of gender. We have the civil society that is key on trying to push on matters, either corruption or gender. I remember we've had a partnership with UN Women as we try to discuss the aspects of gender and corruption while we're trying to formulate our gender-sensitive complaints mechanism system. So ideally, we have various agencies, various commissions, but each one of them is dealing with either one aspect, that is gender, or corruption. But fortunately, we're able to deal with both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary. I think we have seen 3 steps. First, understand the problem and the reality. Then build consciousness, and then implement things for the better. And so we are in our next topic, how we can achieve gender equality. We know that today, in almost none country of the world, is a level playing field. Therefore, this question is of utmost importance. What can be done in practice? Karin Jemtin, I know you know a lot about it. It's a big part of your professional life. If you could share some ideas on how to achieve gender equality in practical terms.
Thank you very much for a question that could take years. If we had had the answer to it, then we wouldn't be here. But we'll try to find some keys anyway to advance the gender agenda and strengthen the role of, or the position of, women in all spheres of society. There are no countries in the world that have reached sort of complete gender equality. One can measure it in different ways, but there is nowhere actually. We are at different stages and we all work in different ways and look at it, but there is no, also in our country, which is perceived to be very gender equal, there are big gender inequalities when it comes to care work at home and unpaid household work, etc., etc. One can have many other examples. But I would say that one of the most important areas, or 2 of the most important areas, have been touched upon by Mary and Jennifer before me. One is data, to have gender disaggregated data in all kinds of areas. Jobs and economic data, of course, but also health, healthcare data, education data, who does what data, unpaid household work data, etc., etc. Data and knowledge is key to be able to know what are the real questions, where should we start with the interventions. So data is important. The second issue I would like to raise again is actually to see that it is a matter of power relations. Often where the most important areas are in most countries in the world populated by men, where the biggest decisions are taken. That's what it looks like. So this leads me to say that we have to work in 2 ways. One is, of course, targeted intervention, strengthen women by capacity building, training of different ways, from when they are young children up till professional age, and also elderly women. Capacity build them to make it possible for women to actually take the place that they are, that we all have the right to actually in society, the place we want to take. The other way of working is, of course, mainstreaming gender into all different intervention, recognizing that the way we provide water can be done in a gender sensitive way, making it easier for women to do other things in life than fetch water or boil water or handle water in one way or other, wash the clothes, etc., whatever it is. And also it can provide security for women in different areas if water are close to households, etc., etc. One can always look upon that issue in different ways, but mainstream gender into all kinds of areas, that is tricky, because if one only mainstreams, one risks it risks the puzzle of, or the part of capacity building, strengthening women, risks to disappear. So one has to do both. There is sometimes a discussion between either or, and I tend to say we have to do both, mainstream and have targeted interventions, strengthening the groups that are not strengthened today, and that's often women, girls, etc. One can have an example from now. We have the COVID-19. The education crisis will be, or is rather, immense now when looking at how many children have not been able or allowed to go to school. The ones who have lost out the most are young girls. Several of them being married away, actually, and will never ever have the possibility of get back to school. So there we have to look upon the whole of the education sector, strengthen it, but put an extra focus on the girls who have actually lost a lot during the pandemic. We work with this in many different ways and in all sectors, trying to strengthen women in politics, women in economy, in the economic sector, in the agriculture sector, but also looking at areas like gender responsive budgeting, etc. But always mainstreaming and working with targeted interventions. Sorry for being long, but this is really an important sector and a very broad and wide sector, and something that it's important to recognize that none of us have achieved. We're not there yet.
Thank you very much, Karin. As you mentioned yourself, it's a topic, it's a theme for years and years. We are talking about processes, long processes. But and today we have only 1 hour. But you gave us some very important.
Daniel, you are muted.
Oh, I didn't mute myself. Can I ask the administration to give me voice again?
No, I can actually hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it should be fine.
Okay. Yeah. Now it's fine. Again, thank you very much to resume such a complex topic for which we have to work on for years and years in such a resumed way, with the keywords targeted interventions as well as mainstreaming, data, and capacity building, of course. As this event, unfortunately, is coming to an end, I would like to come back to the broad international agenda 2030, and especially the international anti-corruption agenda. We can say that this year, 2021, is an anti-corruption year. We have UNGASS now. At the end of the year, we have the big conference of the state parties. And I think it's an opportunity we should catch for this much prominent discussion and achievements in our topics. So my question is, what can be the role of our convention, of the UNGASS convention, and especially in the context with the conference end of the year in Cairo? Jennifer, you are the expert in UNODC, and UNODC is in UNGASS on the lead. So I would like to give you the word, and after your words, also asked Mary, what are the views of Kenya, of an African country?
Thank you, Mr. Kempken. Well, you know, one of the most interesting things about the Convention Against Corruption is, of course, that it speaks about how we all have a role to play in the fight against corruption. And I think, you know, we mustn't forget that. Now we're speaking governments, we're speaking private sector, public sector, but we all, from the very micro level to the macro level, we all have a role to play, not only in fighting corruption, but also in changing this narrative about women's role in society. Yeah, we all have a role to play there. And I think it's fair enough to say it's a learning process. Look, I mean, the MDGs, when they came out, corruption was nowhere. I don't think it would have even been mentioned in the General Assembly Hall. However, look at where we are today. Yeah. And I think this is also why we speak about, we reference the time is now as our call to action, right? The time is now. And we have this fantastic opportunity this year, being the anti-corruption year. UNGASS, we now will have, come Friday, a political declaration. Coming up in December, we have the conference of the states parties to the convention. Now is the time to make good on these promises and push through. And, you know, it's never easy to blaze the trail, but somebody has to do it. So I am also, you know, looking to the organizers here. This is launching the gauntlet and saying, is this the time to ensure that our resolutions in the Conference of the States Party have gender mentioned in them, have speaking about the differentiated impact of corruption on women and men? Because until now, in the history of the conference, we only have 3 resolutions that mention either women or gender. So again, I will end on that and say, yeah, the time is now. This is it. We have to step up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We are very similar in thinking. I'm also an optimist, and therefore thank you very much for the remark that in the MDGs there was no anti-corruption. Now it is there. We know anti-corruption, rule of law is under pressure, but we have opportunities as well. Mary, I would like to give you the floor on the same topic, year of corruption, the conferences this year and the chances.
I love the statement that has been made by Jennifer that in fact it's no longer about the nation, it's now more of the private sector, of the public sector, you know, of the organizations coming up, because we've noted that in fact, Kenya is committed to the fight against corruption. This is something that we've had since time immemorial. So we know we should not uphold, we should not propagate aspects of corruption. But from that high level, we become blind, we become deaf, we become immune to that aspect of corruption. But we still note that, in fact, our president is on the leadership front of upholding or trying to strengthen and support the Generation Equality Forum, what it is that is building up on the gender balance, coming up sometime in June in Paris. So we know that on both aspects of gender balance and anti-corruption, we strive to hold hands and now not only understand it from a slogan perspective, but as a belief that we're having, a culture that we're trying to change. So that in the next generation, these are things that we'll keep on referring as a vice that occurred and a vice that we're able to fight over. So we need to put our best foot forward now. We talk about Egypt, we need to put our best foot forward and fight it. After all, we propagated it, so we can actually disintegrate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, especially for mentioning the private sector as well. And the fight will go on, la lucha continua. Before closing this important event, with the final words of Mrs. Karin Jemtin, I would like to thank you all. To thank Dr. Mary Kimari and the Office of the Ombudsman in Kenya. To thank Jennifer Savary Bradford and UNODC. To thank our Parliamentary Secretary, Dr. Flaxbart, our Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and of course GIZ for organizing this virtual event. I think altogether we brought about a better understanding of the complex relationship and important relationship and strong relationship between gender and anti-corruption. Karin, please be so kind to close the event with the key messages we have pointed out.
Thank you. I thank you, Mr. Kempken. I think that you did that yourself, but there are many important links. And I would say there are positive links and there are negative links. And we must use the positive reinforcing of strengthening the role of women to participate in society, and thus make it possible to see where corruption occurs and to stop it, etc., and hinder it from happening. But I would like to say thank you for excellent moderating. And I'm very honored to be able to take part in this panel. I have learned a lot, and that was also an aim of this side event, to recognize, to see the links, but also to learn. And I have learned, and I will take that with. And I must also say that I hope that, or rather that I leave this side event with the feeling of an obligation to continue this work. Yeah. And that is a feeling I hope I share with many who have listened to this hour. Thank you very much, and we will continue.
Mrs. Karin-Jemtin, thank you very much for your wonderful participation, and thanks Sida as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See you in Sharm el Sheikh.
Yeah.
At the conference.
Hopefully.